Here we got a quick video about the basics of the infectious response unit for AQA Biology. Now, before we get started, just make sure to put your phones on silent, pop them out the way, because this is, if anything, one of the most important topics right now. We need a good understanding of these mechanisms if we're going to understand what's going on in the world. So, let's start off with the idea of things called pathogens. Okay, pathogens. Now, a pathogen is essentially a microorganism that when it gets inside your body can cause you to catch what's called a communicable or transferable or infectious disease. Okay, in the case of pathogens, we've got a number of examples. Classic ones like bacteria, like something like E. coli, maybe. So you eat some food that has some bacteria in it, and those bacteria divide inside your body and produce toxins, and those toxins make you ill and you have food poisoning. It's a classic example of a bacterial infection. Another one that I'm sure you're acutely aware of is virus. Now, viral infections often are spread by droplet infections. So in the case of COVID-19, we have droplets of mucus in the air when people cough and they go into your body. The virus infects you by taking over your genetic mechanisms to make replications of itself. So it kind of hijacks your cells and causes them to divide and divide and divide until they have made millions of virus particles, and those viral particles then get released into the body and damaging the cell, causing it to be destroyed, and that causes the infection to spread and to increase in its severity. You also have fungi, though, that can cause infections. So fungi are obviously mushrooms, but we're talking about at the moment the unicellular fungi. So things like athlete's foot or thrush are both fungal infections. There can even be a fungal infection of the heart that some people are unfortunate enough to come down with. So although fungi seems unlikely to be the cause of most diseases that people get, it is possible. And then there's a fourth one that is one that's very less well known than the other three, and it's a thing called a protist. Now, a protist is essentially a small simple organism, and in this case they're often parasites, so they're often small living things. You would probably have heard of the disease malaria, which is caused by a protist, and that's a classic situation where the malarial protist that lives in the body is then transferred via mosquito bites to other hosts and causes the disease to spread. Okay. Now, these pathogens are around us all the time. They're constantly in the air, they're on surfaces, but 99.999% of them never really have a chance to make you ill. Maybe you'll get a cold in the winter. Maybe if you don't look after your food, you'll get a poorly tummy. Maybe if you don't wash properly, you'll get athlete's foot. But generally, most people spend most of their life incredibly healthy. The reason most people spend all their time being completely healthy is due to the wonderful mechanisms that we have inside our body to protect ourselves. So we have two types of immune system. We have the actual immune system, which is essentially the cells that respond, mainly white blood cells, to protect us. But then we also have a load of non-specific physical barriers that prevent us from being infected. One of the most important ones is called the skin. So the skin is brilliant at protecting us. It's made of layers and layers of dead cells, and those cells are incredibly tough and incredibly hard for pathogens to invade through. And it covers most of our body. The places where it doesn't cover, we have other mechanisms in place. So, for example, your eyes, they have tears. And tears contain enzymes called lysozymes, and every time you blink, the tears wash over your eyeball, and the enzymes destroy any bacteria or virus or fungi that might have been on there. Fingers crossed. In most cases it works brilliantly well. So we've got a role of enzymes there. You also have a nose, and in your nose you have lots of hairs that are there to trap particulates that you might inhale to prevent them from going down into your body and making you ill. So the nose does a job of filtering the air. Down your trachea here, which goes to your lungs, you may have remembered it being called the windpipe. In your trachea you have tons and tons of cells that are called ciliated cells. So here's my cell, and it has these hairs on it that are called cilia. And the cilia are there to waft along the mucus. And by wafting along the mucus of your throat, they bring it up to your nose, and they prevent particulates going down into your lungs and making you ill. So to summarize, the skin is a barrier. It just physically stops bacteria or other pathogens from entering. The eyes have tears, which contain enzymes, which help break down invading pathogens. The nose has hairs to trap particulates, and the trachea has these cilia which move the mucus on and out and up to your nose and make you sneeze it out to prevent it going into your body. So we talked about our kind of physical non-specific barriers. Now we're going to talk about cell-mediated immunity, i.e. the immunity that white blood cells come into play. Now, white blood cells are incredibly important. It's actually a very complex area. You're not expected to know all the different types of white blood cells, but you are expected to know that they do three things, and three things really, really well. Okay, the first thing they're going to do is going to be called phagocytosis. Phagocytosis. Now, if we break this word down, what we want to say is that phage essentially means eat. Okay, so phagocytosis basically means eating cells. And in this case, we can interpret that as being eating by cells. So they're cells that eat pathogens. Okay, and the thing I want you to picture is our good friend Pac-Man, or Miss Pac-Man if you prefer. When we're thinking about phagocytosis, we want to think a bit like Pac-Man. Okay, the white blood cells that perform phagocytosis, they spend their time in the body. Anytime they find something that doesn't belong in the body, they will eat it, essentially. They will surround it with their cell membrane. It kind of looks a bit like this. So here's the white blood cell, here's its nucleus, and here is my little pathogen. They will surround it with their cell membrane. They fold their cell membrane in. They will create what's called a vesicle, a little bag that the pathogen is in, and then they will destroy it by releasing enzymes into that area and destroying the pathogen. And they'll go along and do that again and again and again and again to anything that's not supposed to be in your body. So it's even been found that some white blood cells perform phagocytosis in the cavity of your lungs. So they found that smokers actually have their tar digested away essentially by phagocytes if they stop smoking for a period of time. The next thing they do is they produce antibodies. Now, antibodies are incredibly specific. Okay, phagocytosis is incredibly non-specific. Okay, so this area here, around here, this is very much non-specific. Doesn't care, as long as it's not part of the body, it will attack it. There's no cleverness to it, there's no sophistication. Whereas antibodies are incredibly sophisticated. So on a pathogen, here's my pathogen. On my pathogen there are what are called protein spikes or carbohydrate spikes on the cell membrane. Now these things are unique. They're like a fingerprint or an ID for that pathogen. They're not there on purpose, they're just a consequence of evolution. They perform roles for the pathogen. But for us, what they allow us to do is identify that bacteria or virus or fungi or whatever it is. And our white blood cell, so here's a white blood cell, what it's going to do is it's going to create tiny little Y-shaped molecules called antibodies. And these antibodies are going to be floating through the blood. And when they get to a pathogen, they're going to latch on. And they're going to latch on around the pathogen. Now what they do is they target the pathogen for destruction. So now this pathogen has essentially been tagged, and the other white blood cells can come on in, like phagocytes and other white blood cells that are not in the specification can come in and digest it. They also bind them together, they make them stick together so they can't transfer themselves through the body very easily. So antibodies play a role. Here's my antibody here, and this is my white blood cell that's made the antibodies, of making sure that that particular pathogen is destroyed without affecting any other part of the body. Antibodies can also be remembered by white blood cells that are called memory cells. So once you've had an illness once, the second time that pathogen comes along, the antibodies are there and they're released straight away, and so you don't even know you've been infected. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about vaccination. And then the third thing they do is they produce antitoxins. Now antitoxins are almost exactly the same as white blood cells, but in some cases, let's draw ourselves a slightly different thing here. Here's a bacteria with a flagellum, and this flagellum bacteria is producing these molecules that are toxin molecules. So here is a toxin. And what the white blood cell does in this case is it's the toxin that's going to make the person ill. A good example of this is botulism, which is a bacteria that produces a toxin. So even after the bacteria is sterilized, you can still get botulism poisoning from the toxin that's around. And so instead of it having antibodies that attack the actual bacteria, they produce very similar molecules that then go and attack the toxins. So they end up surrounding the toxins like this and prevent them from working and then allow them to be digested. So our white blood cells do a huge range of things. This is called cell-mediated immunity. They go around and they constantly perform phagocytosis on foreign invaders in a non-specific way. They are raised up when you have an infection against a specific pathogen and you generate antibodies which can attack the pathogen directly or can cancel out as antitoxins, and then they create this concept of memory, which we'll talk about in a later video. Memory, where we are allowed to have an immune system that adapts over time and remembers previous infections.